Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a Q&A for QSAs on PCI DSS 4, requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. Our PCI DSS expert speakers will talk about the browser script requirements and shed some light on common misconceptions. We hope that this will be an interactive session, so please put questions and comments in the chat and we'll answer them as we go along. So with that, I will pass it to our speakers to introduce themselves. Troy, you want to go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Troy Leach. I was with the PCI Council from the early days and predate the council, really. Started with American Express, where I joined some colleagues from the other payment brands, established the PCI Council, was one of the first employees and executives for the council, was the CTO and chief standards architect, oversaw the development of PCI DSS and my team's development of it for about almost 18 years, big predate in the early days of working on those requirements. And so that's my background. I am now a chief strategy officer at a similar type of organization, the Cloud Security Alliance. That's a little bit about me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Zittimer. I lead product management for client-side defense and the new PCI DSS requirements related to client-side defense. Yeah, it's let's go ahead.
Okay. So with that, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the requirements by now. But Troy, can you give us a very quick overview?
Yeah, I think this is something that assessors have been talking quite a bit with me lately. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, I think I've talked with 4 or 5 of the most prominent QSAs out there doing PCI assessments. This has definitely come up in most of those conversations. It's looking at something that I've been trying to personally, and is also as part of the PCI Council, foreshadow that these were coming in the PCI requirements probably as early as 2017, 2016, in the keynotes. If anyone attended the PCI community meetings, I would typically be on stage talking about some of the emerging risks that we saw in the e-commerce channel, how things are shifting from as more of the world was saturated with chip cards, how it would be moving to other channels that were more susceptible to versions of fraud. And we're starting to see this attack in the consumer browser, looking at ways that really circumvented any type of direct monitoring that merchants might have with all the various source code that they receive and actually is formed and built within a consumer's browser. So with that in mind, 2 new requirements were introduced, and they will go into effect next or later in this quarter. That is 643 around the management of scripts and making sure that those anything within the payment environment, the payment page, and could influence the payment page is going to have authorization to be within that environment so that there is integrity of the overall payment transaction, that there is no middleware, any type of e-skimming or types of attacks that might happen as a result of that. And then also that's in the software requirement 6, then also within just the monitoring and integrity of all the controls that are in place. That's what requirement 11 really was built to be, was a insurance that all the prior requirements had a way to be continuously monitored and assure that those controls were effective. In 11.6.1, we have change in tamper detection, making sure that we can have notices and alerts for HTTP headers as they are received and their other content is received. So that's a quick overview. I'm sure most of the assessors on the phone have already been talking with customers for quite some time, but that is really the crux of those 2 requirements.
Great, thank you. So you touched a little bit on why these requirements were added to prevent digital skimming, mage card, things like that. So Jeff, can you share at a high level how a mage card attack works?
Yes, so at a very high level, and let's walk through this diagram a little bit. So I like starting at the top right. So think of yourself as a user. You go online, you visit some of your favorite stores and some of your less favorite ones, like maybe paying a parking fine or utility bill. And that website that you are visiting, it's not the static websites of several years ago now, but rather a very dynamic site that is that includes a lot of code that runs within your browser. But you're getting that from either the website that you're visiting or a whole lot of third parties that provide that code to serve various needs, like tracking you across websites as one example to be able to retarget you with ads, or the chatbot, or the checkout scripts. All the checkout functionality itself of a website are typically coming through scripts, and just so much more. Anything interactive about a site is because it's running JavaScript. And so what happens is, if a malicious attacker, so now looking at the left side here, is able to get anywhere within that supply chain of JavaScripts that make it to the browser, again, not even directly from from the site you're visiting, but to your browser directly from all kinds of third and fourth parties, because each of those scripts also has dependencies on other scripts. If an attacker is able to get anywhere within that supply chain and run code on that browser, that code effectively in that browser has almost uninterrupted access to pretty much anything going on there within that session, within that tab. And so the way a mage cart typically works is, as you are going about your business, interacting with the website, entering your card details to check out, or entering your credentials to log in, that JavaScript on the site can read everything that you've entered into those fields. And a little bit of asterisk. There are various ways to control that, but the way a skimming attack typically works is they can read those details as the user types them in, and then they just exfiltrate that in various ways, send it to their own server, and then that way are able to collect the whole long list of records of whatever they're after, right? So in the context of PCI, that's obviously the account data and the CVV. But in broader context, stealing login credentials is very effective that way, or all kinds of other privacy information that really shouldn't be shared with third parties, or at least not in an undisclosed way as a recognized data processor, et cetera, with proper contracts in place. Now, once the attacker has those details, obviously they can commit all kinds of fraud with it, right? So if it's credit card details, then obviously credit card fraud is the most obvious. And the way, or a huge component of those attacks, the way they typically happen is what we call a carding attack, where a bot will run all of these lists of cards that they have against websites to see which cards are still active, haven't been canceled yet, and work, and then commit fraud against those cards. And this is, by the way, where human security fits in beyond what we do with client-side defense and these PCI requirements to protect from the actual mage cart, is for later down the line attacks like carding or credential stuffing, which is what you do with all these credentials that you steal, is how we can help protect sites and users further down the line. So this is just part of, along that whole attack chain, trying to prevent that theft in the first place, is what client-side defense does. It's also, in this case, also very much related to PCI, which is very much about controlling those JavaScripts on the site and proactively managing them, ensuring they're not doing anything they're not supposed to do. And yeah, it's ultimately to prevent attacks of this type. Then there are various, there are a few other permutations of this as well.
Thank you, Jeff. So we actually just got a question in. Does Human provide an application for merchants for real-time alerts and push notifications on suspicious activity, specifically for iOS or Android?
Specifically for iOS or Android. So if the iOS and Android, if the app's running on them, or if it's just the browser, if the apps are web apps, or if it's just the Safari browser, etc., then yes, then the exact same same behavior. We would get to that later, but if our sensor is there running on the site, then yes, we will observe any activity taken by the JavaScripts, and if there's anything risky, suspicious, then we will alert on them as an incident.
Great, thank you. So I know we're planning to leave the human stuff until the end, but given that we got a question about it, do you think you can give a quick overview of what it is that human offers?
Sure. So the way we deploy is with a JavaScript JavaScript tag, like kind of the one JavaScript to rule them all, that the merchant or payment service provider, it could be as well, adds to their online store. And so when the user visits the site and gets all of the JavaScripts that come with it, either directly from the site or because the site is saying go get these JavaScripts from everywhere else, then our JavaScript is running there, and then it kind of wraps all the other scripts that load and sits between them and the interfaces of the browser, and then it reports back to our cloud backend on effectively anything running on those interfaces. So not the data itself, but just the action that was taken. So i.e. we don't collect like, here's the credit card number that was read, but we will say this script read this credit card number with, in the session or in a specific timestamp, etc. We send all of that information back to our cloud backend. From there, obviously we do a lot of processing on it, and then we surface within our UI and send alerts, and we have an API where you can consume all those different events, or you can, within the UI, specifically an interface to help manage your JavaScripts precisely the way PCI expects, or completely in line with how PCI expects, and with a whole lot on top of it to just make that as simple and painless as possible with additional automations, integrations to some of your favorite tools, and then on top of that, we also have mitigation. So if you've set up policies appropriately, if you're interested, you can set up policies that tell our sensor in the browser in real time to start blocking very granularly any activity that you don't want happening there. So for example, very easy to just set up a rule that no script is allowed to read cardholder data, with maybe the exception of say that little script that identifies from the first few digits, if it's a MasterCard or a Visa, to show you that little logo. That'd be one of very few exceptions that you may allow. So you can create a rule like that, and then have a lot more peace and quiet that all these scripts that you are authorizing, because they have business justification to be there, and you're authorizing them despite some behavior that could potentially pose a security risk. You're okay with it because you've also blocked a lot of the worst potential downside that could happen from those scripts.
Great, thank you. Okay, now back to our top misconceptions. Jeff, can you explain why websites that use payment iframes are still in scope for 643 and 1161?
Thank you. Yeah, so there's a common misconception that because I have an iframe, maybe I don't need to do PCI DSS at all, or maybe, okay, the iframe, because it sort of runs in a separate context, and if implemented properly, the browser is able to kind of sandbox that away from all the JavaScripts on the site. The classic skimming attack that I explained before, in that case, it would have a hard time actually skimming and reading the credit card information directly from the fields where the consumer enters that information. However, the scripts running on there can still cause a lot of other damage. So if they get in there before the scripts, the actual payment scripts, they can inject themselves into the payment scripts that often will be open the iframe, so they can end up injecting themselves into the iframe. They can In other ways, okay, there is this iframe and the payment form. These other scripts can also open their own iframe and payment form that the browser will show on top of the real one. And so as the user enters the details, it's not that the attacker is then is effectively skimming it, but you're literally entering the details into the attacker's iframe that goes directly to the attacker's server. Scripts can also redirect the user to a different page and say checkout here, and it'll look a lot like the checkout page of the merchant, but the consumer ends up on a completely different checkout page. There's just a few examples, but an iframe can't protect of all of those things. It's amazing protection of the skimming, which is the most common, threatening, hardest to detect. But there is still a lot more that can be done, and therefore an iframe does not sort of remove the need for managing those other scripts on there.
Makes sense. Thank you. Troy, why can't these requirements be carried out as part of the DevSecOps pipeline?
So, I think one of the challenges that we have is a very dynamic type of e-commerce environment these days. And so while there are elements of DevSecOps especially around the monitoring and feedback that may touch into this area, reality is much that gets pushed is actually coming from third parties and fourth parties. And that was a very intentionally explicitly called out, that it's not just third parties, it could be fourth parties. And within that, you start to get away from being able to monitor and identify other companies' practices around DevSecOps. Hopefully, if you outsource completely to a third party and they are doing a lot of the proprietary, there is some form of contractual SLA in place with them, but there's limitations because, and especially we're moving into this era where the traditional push of proprietary code scripts out is really changing. I think the traditional homepage for any major merchant is over 100 resources being pulled from different locations. I do think in probably someone in the audience will roll their eyes around generative AI and where it's going to go, but we already see a massive push within the market. Chase did a survey in late 2023, and already then, I think Chase's survey, and there's a similar by IDC that said around 22% of all merchants had already, by late 2023, deployed generative AI into their payment processing. And about another 45%, so over half, about 65% of the market was already exploring over, a year and a half ago, they were already exploring how to incorporate. And with that, I think there's going to be a lot more dynamic code generation that will happen autonomously. And so what happens is that hopefully there will be some oversight. There will be applied DevSecOps of all these different parties. But the challenge you have is that you will have just a diversity of sources. It's not going to be just derived from one server side, that you can have one process and know that all code is run through that process. I think that's the dynamic nature of how and where software development is going is why just that you cannot rely exclusively on the DevSecOps approach.
Great, thank you. So third misconception. Jeff, can you explain scoping PCI DSS 4 for single page applications?
Yes, thank you. So so first off, right, what only payment page scripts. So we already touched a little bit on the iframe topic. So same thing, the pages on that parent page that embed the iframe are also in scope. So that we already know. But then the question is, okay, that page that embeds the iframe, which is probably the most typical pattern that we see, where does that page start and end? And so in the old world, when anytime you clicked on a link as you went through a website, the page fully loaded on every page. Then also all the JavaScript for the page that was previously loaded, all that was wiped out. And for this new page, just new JavaScript was loaded for it. And so if you still have a website like that, and there still are plenty of those, then by the time you get to that page that embeds the iframe, the page is just loaded fresh, and so you need to manage only the JavaScripts on that page that loaded from that moment on. The problem with single page apps is that while the user is getting the illusion that they're on a new page, in fact, as the name of the app suggests, it is a single page app. So the entire app is a single page. And what this means in reality that happens within the browser is, as the graphic here on the side shows, as the user navigates through the different pages of the site, the scripts, any script that's loaded on what seems to be a page, every script that loads just adds and compounds on top of scripts that were there earlier. And so by the time you reach that final page that embeds the parent page, you don't just have the few scripts that were required for the functionality of that view that the user is in, but rather you have all of the scripts that were collected throughout the user journey. And that could be a very different list of scripts each time, depending on which journey the user took. And so that's something very important to be aware of, that effectively you need to manage, in the end of the day, all of those scripts. Or probably the better option, but certainly comes with a lot of trade-offs and a lot of work, is to separate out, and okay, your app is a single page app, but on that last click where you go to the page where the user sees the fields, have that be a fully fresh load that then wipes out all the previous JavaScripts, and then it's very easy for you to really keep very tightly in there only the scripts that are absolutely necessary. And so you've just shrunk down the attack surface that much. I'll just a little plug in here for human security. It's kind of whichever path you choose. Like our tool will work and will give you what you need.
Got it. Thanks. So misconception 4. Troy, do organizations have to use CSP or SRI to assure integrity?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this answer brief so we can get to all 5 of these misconceptions in our allotted time. And I think the answer is these are 2 recommendations within today by the PCI Council. And if people are longtime assessors, they know that in the past, a lot of what we built into the standard, into the guidance section, if it was recommended there, sometimes it would evolve and mature into becoming de facto requirements 2 to 5 years later. I do not see this being the case for both of these for a few reasons. These are current recommendations, but they have limitations, and especially as we talk about how software development is truly being transformed right now, and it is going to look incredibly different in just a couple of years. So with the SRI technology, I think there's some limitations around the use of hashes, and kind of similar to also file integrity monitoring. It's got some limitations. It's great in that it does meet the objectives, but it really on a very minimal scale. And I think how, again, just to emphasize the point, how dynamic things are changing, there's some limitations. With CSP, I think there's a little bit more. What I like about it is it does prevent real-time blocking, something that the human can do as well. I think that, again, the challenge is that it's where it's being derived from, and it's a server-side technique that is going to limit where and how it enforces. So I think both of them are good techniques. I think there are better techniques that will be more commonplace and more dynamic. So that would be my suggestion, is that yes, these are are recommendations, but are clearly not mandatory. These are just what I would consider the base level to meet the overall objective. Obviously, with version 4, there's a lot of new ways, customized ways that you can create any of these requirements. But that would be my sense is that that's probably the floor and not the ceiling for what you could do to prevent these types of risk.
Thanks. Jeff, do you have anything you want to chime in here about kind of how this approach compares to the real-time monitoring of JavaScript in the browser, et cetera?
Yeah, trying real quick. The challenge with these are that they are very brittle. They can break your site. SRI will break your site and not even tell you. And their SRI will only work for that first script that's loaded, but any other scripts that are loaded after SRI is just completely irrelevant. So you still need a way to assure their integrity. CSP is just nearly impossible to maintain in a very tight manner, and even if you go very much out of your way to have a very, very tight CSP, it's still very easily bypassable because you're gonna need to, for example, allow say Amazon S3 buckets, and then an attacker can very easily use an Amazon S3 bucket that will then be allowed. So a lot of so they're very hard to manage, and they're very limited in any case with their efficiency and effectiveness. So while any security approach is always best if it's multi-tiered and multi-layered, so probably using at least a fairly basic CSP 80/20, right? Very, very small effort, you get a lot of to block the most basic stuff. It's probably recommended. But then there are much better techniques to be able to achieve everything else.
Great, makes sense. And as we received a comment from Gary, that CSP and SRI can meet some of the requirements, 643 and 11.6.1, but not all of the things required. So that's
absolutely.
good.
Trying to use them to actually build everything you need for compliance is going to be very, very difficult, because you still need to say consume all those reports that come in from CSP and somehow organize them and present them and get people to look at them and authorize or justify them and keep track of all that paperwork. That's just the tip of the iceberg of how much extra effort would have to go into sort of building your full 643 11.6.1 strategy around CSP and SRI. And very importantly, like, they actually don't help with 11.6.1, because 11.6.1 more or less says if your CSP changes, then you need to know about it. You need to be alerted of it. Not just it, right? All security impacting headers, but right, CSP isn't going to tell you if somebody changed your CSP. Just one other example. So there's definitely a lot of effort that would have to go into setting something up and then maintaining it and doing all the activities that you're expected to do on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so a last misconception is that you have to block unauthorized scripts immediately. Troy, why is this not the case?
Yeah, and you see the highlighted language in the guidance from the PCI Council. I think it relates actually to the CSP conversation as well. So Jeff mentioned the ability to circumvent some of the policy. I think the other side of it is that the policy can be designed too rigorously. So there's a lot of effort that goes into designing the CSP, and you could have a unintentional consequence of not doing payments at all. And I think that is no one's desire, right? Obviously it's lowered risk, but just unplugging from the internet's the greatest security control we have, right? So there's always a little bit of risk and understanding, but there is going to be circumstances. I think we are entering an era where there's going to be more and more situations where there's going to have to be a different risk profile and management of incoming scripts and how you go about evaluating that. and especially because, not to go on a slightly off tangent, but if you look at some of the controls, independent controls like CVS's scoring and the National Vulnerability Database and things where we've derived some of what is the risk to some of the software, the enumeration of these vulnerabilities is far lacking. And I in talking with some government officials, I think we're going to be farther and farther behind. So all that to say, at times we're going to be, that there's going to have to be a cadence and a process that understands that you will possibly need to have a script loaded. It's going to be loaded dynamically. It's going to be loaded autonomously from any type of human interaction. And then there needs to be a human oversight over time. But the reality of how complex and where code is pulling from, that's why the PCI Council has put in this caveat that understands that hopefully it's coming from a trusted source. We have other parameters that will hopefully give higher confidence and lower the risk of receiving and loading that software. But it may be that a revision of a script is been pushed, and it will need that proper authorization by the merchant over time. But that oversight is just not realistic today for many merchants in all circumstances. So that's why the PCI Council has put this caveat in there.
Thanks for explaining that. We got another question. What is the scalability of the script rules that Jeff spoke on earlier? If acquirers hosting different payment facilitators uses a service like Human, can general rules be put into place for all of the payment pages under that scope? Can that reduce scope with these rules?
I want to say yes, but I wonder if there's something I'm missing in the question. But effectively, you can have fairly generic rules that say, for example, no script is allowed to access payment fields, or you can have rules specific to any, like as now down to any one specific script doing one specific action, or at the vendor level to say, okay, these are my rules for PayPal and these are my rules for Stripe. So hopefully I answered the question.
Yeah, and I'm looking there. So if it's an acquirer hosting different PayFacs, I think it's going to be dependent probably on how heterogeneous the different scripts that are being managed individually. But it sounds like, and I think you're right, Jeff. It sounds like if a solution like Human is in place, there could be a broader consistency of how the risk is evaluated for all these codes. And I don't know if it would reduce the scope, but you would help to have a homogenized security practice that might reduce the not the scope of the assessment, but maybe the procedural effort to evaluate the risk. So that might be a reduction of effort that way.
Got it. I think that makes sense. Thank you both for explaining these misconceptions and answering everyone's questions. We are recording this, so we will be putting this out for on-demand viewing, and everyone who attended or registered will receive it. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have more questions. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.